go behind the scenes to see how we get wool from sheep, mainly the harvesting and processing of sheep wool. It has been established that wools can originate from a couple of animals, of which sheep is the most common. However, the term wool can also be used to describe inorganic products, such as glass wool and mineral wool, that have similar properties as those of natural animal wool. Regardless, one thing remains the same in both types of wool: the composition. Being an animal fiber means that wool is made up of protein coupled with a small amount of lipids, and inorganic wool is made to be quite similar to natural wool. The composition of natural wool makes it pretty different chemically from other plant fibers like cotton, which are primarily cellulose-based products. Natural wool is often produced from follicles located on the upper layer of the animal's skin, called epidermis, which later pushes down into the layer of skin called the dermis as the wool fibers develop. These follicles could either be primary or secondary follicles. Primary follicles give rise to three types of fiber: true wool fibers, medullated fibers, and kemp, while secondary follicles only create true wool fibers. Wool's crimp, the strong natural wave seen in each wool fiber as it is on the animal, makes it easier to spin the wool by allowing the individual fibers to stick to each other so they remain together. Thanks to the wool's crimp, fabrics made from wool have more bulk than most fabrics and can retain air, making the fabric an excellent heat retainer. Wool also has a great specific thermal resistance, which allows it to inhibit heat transfer altogether. This particular effect has profited desert peoples like the Bedouins and Tuaregs, who use wool clothes for heat insulation. Felting of wool arises due to hammering or other mechanical agitation of the wool fibers, which causes the microscopic barbs on the surface of wool fibers to hook together. The felting process can be done in two different methods: dry felting or wet felting. Wet felting involves the use of water and a lubricant, usually an alkali such as soap, which are applied to the wool, which is subsequently agitated until the wool fibers mix and bond together. Temperature shock while the wool is wet heightens the felting process, and sometimes natural felting can take place on the animal's back. There are many qualities that differentiate hair and fur from wool, such as its crimps and elasticity. The number of crimps in the wool fibers determines the fineness of the fibers. Finer wool like merino could possibly have about 40 crimps per centimeter, or 100 crimps per inch, while rougher wool like caracal could have about 1 crimp per centimeter, or 1 or 2 crimps per inch. On the other hand, hair, also known as kemp, has no crimp and minimal ability to bind into yarn. The relative amounts of wool to kemp vary with each breed of sheep, and this difference makes certain fleeces more desirable for carding, felting, or spinning into bats, used for making quilts and many other insulating products. Based on what has been discussed, most people already know where wool comes from. However, the process of transforming it from sheep's fluffy coat to material used to make clothes is a whole different journey entirely. The wool has to go through a series of processes before it is ready for actual use. And while machinery makes it faster, the process hasn't changed much for many years. The first step of the wool process is shearing the sheep. This simply means cutting off the wool and fleece from the sheep, and it is usually done every year at the end of the winter season using an electric razor. This device can remove all the sheep's fleece in one piece, and as a result, a single sheep can have a fleece that weighs as much as 8 kilos, with the average being 3 to 4 kilograms. When done properly, shearing doesn't harm the sheep, as it leaves a thin coat on the animal for the summer months. After the shearing process, the wool is then sorted into 4 main groups: fleece, broken, bellies, and locks by a wood classer, after which it is then cleaned up for the next stage. The next process is carding, which involves putting the wool through fine metal teeth to straighten out the wool fibers and make them straight, soft, and fluffy. This was originally done by hand using 2 metal combs. However, thanks to technology, machines can be used to card large quantities of wool more quickly. At the end of the carding process, wool fibers are lined up into a thin, flat piece, which can subsequently be drawn into long, thin pieces called rovings. The next step involves spinning the wool into yarn using different methods to make different yarns usable in different clothing. For example, worsted spinning makes thin yarn that can be used for suits and other clothing made with pretty fine material. On the other hand, woolen spinning makes a thicker yarn primarily used for knitting. At this point, the wool can be sold to customers who use it to make scarves, sweaters, and other clothing. Or it can undergo further processing and possibly dyeing to produce more refined final products.